Good afternoon. How are we today? We are shifting gear a bit today. We are moving from the Shashi-Limpopo area, southwestern Zimbabwe, northeastern Botswana, to the south central, where we will specifically focus on Great Zimbabwe. So Great Zimbabwe is one of those interesting places. So as a way of introduction, Great Zimbabwe has a very long sequence of occupation. So the earliest occupation at Great Zimbabwe was between AD 500 and 600. Then there was a break. There was another occupation from AD 900, 1000, and that seems to have continued right up to maybe 1600, and then there was a break, and from 1800 we see modern groups occupying that area. So the developments that are taking place around AD 900 and 1000, they are equivalent to what we discussed yesterday as Leopardoscopy 1. So Leopardoscopy 1 at Great Zimbabwe, that is known by the name of Gumanye, which is the name of an archaeological site from Chibi, which is just about maybe 60 kilometers towards Beitbridge along the Harare Beitbridge Road. And then around 1200 or thereabout, there is what is known as period 3. So period 3 at Great Zimbabwe is the equivalent of Leopardoscopy 2. So that's the same as Mapungubwe. Just that the designs that appear on the local pottery convinced early archaeologists such as Robinson that although there was a relationship with the leopardoscopy, they decided to give it a different name. So there is period 2, period 3, which is like Leopardoscopy 1, Leopardoscopy 2 at Great Zimbabwe. After that, there is what is known as period 4. So that is what is associated with the flourishing of Great Zimbabwe as an urban center. And then period 4 is followed by period 5. So the reason why I'm giving this background is that if Great Zimbabwe had the equivalent of Leopardoscopy 1 and Leopardoscopy 2, why then would it have required stimulus from Mapungubwe for it to develop? I will leave that question unanswered, but rather proceed to provide you with some of the evidence, and then we can always discuss that. What I also decided to do is to try and travel back memory lane, particularly for those who have been to Great Zimbabwe, to try and see the site. I hope this will work. This was part of a documentary that I did with a team of French archaeologists for some televisions in France. So we are going to the hill complex. This is the Great Enclosure here, just to give you an idea of how Great Zimbabwe looks like. So Great Enclosure, these are known as the ridge ruins, and these are the valley ruins, the Western Valley ruins. Here we don't know what was there, but in the 1970s you could play golf here. So it was a very nice green golf course. Then we are going towards the hill complex. There is some material here, but half the time it's always covered in a very dense bush. So we are going to, this is the ancient ascent which runs this way towards the curio shop in this way. And this is the sharp cliff, so that is the hill complex. And this is the western enclosure on the hill. So the terraces that I mentioned yesterday, they are in this side. I'm not so sure what's happening with this, but for now, we are just getting to see the landscape. What you see here, these are the activities of those treasure hunters we mentioned the other day. And so Lake Kyle is in this area, which what is known as Lake Mtirigwi. The hotel is this side. There was also a golf course in this area as well as this side. So western enclosure on the hill are very important. There's also the eastern enclosure where some of those beds were recovered. So those are some of the major features at Great Zimbabwe. And right now we are also going back to the valley enclosures as well as to the great enclosure where we started. So that's what is known as the outspan ruins. The curio shop is here, and then the site museum is Great Zimbabwe Site Museum is also here. What else do we need to know? So Ridge ruins, we have mentioned them, and somewhere here there is a sacred spring that is known as, literally translated into English, is like the little girl. There was a prison here in the 1950s and 60s to provide labor to repair the walls. That was discontinued in the 1970s when Great Zimbabwe became a national park. I think this wall here was reconstructed. And also the western entrance was also reconstructed in 1997. This one has never been touched, so that's the famous parallel passage. And just to give us an idea of how this structure looks like. And this is also where is the conical tower? Okay, we are going to the conical tower somewhere there. The conical tower is also one of those very important structures at Great Zimbabwe during the time when things were very tight in the country. Some spirit mediums managed to convince Uncle Bob that beneath the conical tower lay some endless reserves of gold. So said, well, give us permission to dig, and then, the hyperinflation would go away. But of course, the authorities would not give them that permission. So in short, that's just to give you an idea of how Great Zimbabwe looked like before we get into the subject. One of the issues associated with Great Zimbabwe is what is known as the Zimbabwe controversy, which was quite popular from 1874 onward until probably even the 1970s. In summary, the Zimbabwe controversy basically involved people who believed that Great Zimbabwe was not locally built. Examples include the German geologist and explorer Karl Marx, as well as James Theodore Bent and Richard Hall. So we must also place this Zimbabwe controversy within the context of events that were taking place. That was after the Berlin Congress of 1884-1885. In 1890, we see Cecil John Rhodes interested in establishing a colony in this area. So by 1893, Southern Rhodesia was a colony courtesy of the British South Africa Company. So Cecil John Rhodes actually sponsored Theodore Bent and Richard Hall to perform investigations at the site. So, however, because none of Bent and Hall were properly trained archaeologists, their methods of excavation were so atrocious that they prompted the British Association for the Advancement of Science to send the professional archaeologist David Randall McIver, who had worked in Palestine and other places, to come and investigate at Great Zimbabwe and hopefully solve the origins question. So on the basis of ceramics from Persia, ceramics from China, David Randall McIver concluded that Great Zimbabwe was nothing but local in origin. Nevertheless, in 1907 or thereabout, there was a public lecture here in Cape Town. Where exactly, I don't know. But that lecture was attended by Richard Hall and David Randall McIver. So they were in the same room, and the debate was so fierce that, you know, some fist fighting took place. That is Randall McIver saying, no, this is local, and Richard Hall saying, no, that's not. And the names that were given to some of those places by Richard Hall and co. So the Great Enclosure was referred to as the elliptical temple, because there are some temples that he had in mind, particularly that existed in the Middle East. The hill complex was known as the Acropolis, after the Acropolis in Greece, and also it's built on a hill, and so on. So we must also place this within the context of that time. But nevertheless, the Zimbabwe controversy kick-started archaeological research into the Iron Age in Southern Africa. And indeed, the development of archaeology in Zimbabwe follows what is happening here at Great Zimbabwe. Later on, we will talk about how the nationalists also appropriated Great Zimbabwe as a symbol when they were fighting against colonialism. So this is one of the photographs from early 20th century, so maybe 1913 or thereabout, just showing some of the extensive damage that was caused by Richard Hall and others. So what also alarmed the British Association for the Advancement of Science was that any material from these digs which looked like local was thrown away as having been of no value, because they were looking for material that could establish a strong connection between Great Zimbabwe and the Queen of Sheba, Great Zimbabwe and King Solomon, Great Zimbabwe and Prester John, and the like. Of course, that was quite fanciful thinking. So the people that were involved are basically antiquarians, amateur archaeologists, as well as government agencies. If I may make a comment in terms of the early collection history of objects at Great Zimbabwe. If you have been to Grootskua down the road there, in that Herbert Burger designed house, there is one soapstone bird which was bought by Cecil John Rhodes in 1889. He bought it from a trader traveler known as Willie Posselt, and the bird came to play a very important role in Cecil John Rhodes' imagination and thinking. So if you go to Grootskua, you would realize that the balustrade, the wooden balustrade, is also decorated with the same Zimbabwe bird. The gutters, they are also decorated with the same bird. The fireplaces, they are also decorated with the same iconography. So, Rhodes' alma mater, the University of Oxford, it has a Rhodes House. The same bird tops Rhodes' House at Oxford. So it's just for interest's sake, and that has also transformed Great Zimbabwe into a mobile collection. So both in terms of imagery and the scattering of objects. Of course, there were people like Willie Posselt and others that made money out of selling some of the objects. There are also others who did not declare. As a result, nobody, I don't think that anyone knows the amount of objects that were recovered from Great Zimbabwe and where they are. So you travel elsewhere in the world, then you realize that, oh, there's material from Great Zimbabwe. How did it get here? Nobody really knows. But of course, we have to understand this within the context of its own time. So these are some of the people that were exploring Great Zimbabwe and other places mines for gold. Some people financed their mines through gold, which they got from these ruins. Moving to showing you the general features of the site, what objects were recovered from Great Zimbabwe, and more importantly, what stories have archaeologists built around Great Zimbabwe? What was the purpose of these walls? How many people could have built them, and how many days could it have taken them to do that? Those are some of the issues that we will get to shortly. But this is the site plan of Great Zimbabwe, which was developed by the architect Andon Whitty in 1960. There are smaller peripheral settlements this way as well as that way. But nobody really talks about them that much. So the hill complex is quite an important place within Great Zimbabwe itself and around it. One of the things that we need to understand about Great Zimbabwe is that archaeologists believe that Great Zimbabwe was fully urban. So it was an urban area with a dense concentration of people. And also, Great Zimbabwe has areas that are walled, such as these ones. And it also has these settlements where there were evidently houses, but there were no stone walls. So the traditional thinking is that the elites, the rulers, lived in these walls. And then the commoners lived in these unwalled settlements. So dry stone walling at Great Zimbabwe then is seen as an indicator of class distinction, and also whereby the upper classes occupied the walls, and also the lower classes occupied the areas outside the walls. As an urban center, of course, Great Zimbabwe was supported by a more rural hinterland. So through trade and exchange, through taxation, surplus would have been mobilized from those villages to the center for onward forwarding to the Indian Ocean and the like. That is one of the traditional interpretations of Great Zimbabwe as an urban center, Great Zimbabwe as a redistribution center that mobilized surplus from the hinterland and then redistributed it to other areas. I mentioned that a number of archaeologists have worked at Great Zimbabwe, and this is one of the most abused, or used rather, diagrams from Great Zimbabwe. This was done by Keith Robinson in the occasional papers of the National Museums and Monuments of Southern Rhodesia. So this gives us the time sequence that Great Zimbabwe was occupied. Do we have a scale here? We don't. It's about 4 meters. So that's very deep. And all the phases that I was talking about, period 1, period 2, period 3, period 4, they were recovered from this area, but I will show you a better image. So what archaeologists do sometimes is that we do map the distribution of different activity areas, and then we can also combine that with other techniques such as phosphate mapping. So if you take phosphates, if you take some samples of soil, use citric acid and so on, you can determine the density of human occupation, particularly through the concentrations of phosphates in the soil. So that's what we are seeing here in these deep gray and zones and so on. But overlaying on that map is the distribution of the different phases. So like yellow, period 1, and then period 2 in blue, period 3. So this just repeats that information which I said at the beginning, that period 1, AD 300 to 900 is a little bit generous, but let's work with that for now. And then period 2, 900 to 1000, and so on. So we can also see from this map that even during the flourishing of Great Zimbabwe, not every part was perhaps occupied. This has a bearing on estimating the population, the total population that was resident at Great Zimbabwe. So local pottery from Great Zimbabwe, these are the illustrations, and these are also the classes based on Keith Robinson's work, class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4, and class 5. So there is actually quite a relationship between 2, 3, 4, and perhaps 5. So these ceramics are also quite different to some of those from Mapungubwe, but some researchers see similarities. The most important point is that this is how the local pots from Great Zimbabwe look like. And in terms of material culture, this is stone walling. That's one of them, perhaps the most famous and also emphasized. These are just other examples of the stone walling. This is the conical tower that I was talking about. Quite a very important structure. What was it used for? Is it a grain bin? Is it a phallic symbol? Those are some of the possibilities that people have played with over the course of the 20th century and also in the present. Great Zimbabwe was a center that was associated with long-distance trade, and those connections also included regions as far as China. And this is one of the jade teapots that was recovered from the valley enclosures, what is known as the Renders ruin at Great Zimbabwe. So the joke that sometimes goes around is that, the Chinese in Zimbabwe are well known for selling things that don't last. So the message is that if they could do, if the government of Zimbabwe could convince the Chinese to make things like these which have survived from 1400, that would be cool. But I didn't say it. More evidence of connections with China. These connections would be obviously indirect via the intermediary role of the people on the Swahili coast. So this is what is known as blue on white porcelain. As an aside, this cobalt blue, which is on these ceramics, was actually sourced from Afghanistan and then traded to China. There is some work that was done by some of my colleagues at Oxford that actually demonstrated that even the production of these ceramics in China was a result of raw materials that were gathered from different places. Of course, we also need to understand this within the context of the Silk Route, which was also quite popular by that time. We're talking here of 1450, 1500, and thereabout. But nevertheless, these plates ended up at Great Zimbabwe, where the thinking is that they were also used by the elites, and they are an indicator of class distinction and also an indicator of prestige, because so far they haven't been found from settlements associated with common people. Glass beads were also recovered from Great Zimbabwe. They are believed to have been elite objects. Elizabeth Goodall recovered more than, I think, 150,000 glass beads in the Renders ruin, together with that's the material which was recovered from the same context as that jade teapot that we have seen. There were also some coral beads, some spoon, some lamp holder. And the thinking, particularly by Galek, is that represented maybe material which belonged to a trader who was based at Great Zimbabwe. Then there's also a wooden box that was partly well preserved. So that's where some of the goods were. And I think there are 1 or 2 silver spoons inside that, and a bronze bell in there. So the material is known as the hoard from the Renders ruin. So the interpretations associated with that are quite varied. Some believe that it was they belonged to a trader. Others would like to think that, well, maybe they belonged to the king, and indeed they showed that royalty at Great Zimbabwe had a monopoly over exotic goods. What do I think myself? I don't know. Well, talking of more exotic goods, these are also what are known as wound beads from Great Zimbabwe. There are only 2, if not 3 of these that are known from Mapungubwe. And for Great Zimbabwe, it's quite a lot. And the 2 wound beads from Mapungubwe are coming from the burials. And particularly the one believed to be that of the king, where the rhino was and so on. So in a paper published in 2010, Pete Robertshaw and colleagues, they argue that because these wound beads are only found in perhaps the most important burial, it also means that they belong to the king. So if 2 could belong to a king, you know, and we do the simple maths, how many? What would it say about the significance of these? I don't know. This object here is very interesting for me for the simple reason that when the Portuguese started to sail around when they sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and established their settlements on Mozambique Island as well as on Sofala near the Zambezi Delta, they also started to move inland to trade and exchange. They also displaced the Swahili as the principal traders. Then they observed one important thing, that the residents of the interior, they liked some species of shell, such as kauri, as well as the conus shell. So the conus shell, it was worn as a pendant by chiefs and other people of status. What the Portuguese then did was they started to manufacture ceramic imitations of that of the back end of those conus shells, and this is what we are seeing here. This is not a shell; it's just a ceramic, which was also glazed, but it's an imitation that look exactly the same as the conus shells that are known locally as the ndoro. So why is this important? It is important for some of us because this is an artifact that is known to be Portuguese, and it's also found within stratified deposits at Great Zimbabwe, which means that during the time of Portuguese, there was some activity at Great Zimbabwe. The key question then is, why is it that Great Zimbabwe does not feature in Portuguese imagination? Because the Portuguese, when they established settlements on the plateau, around 1506, 1600, they were at trading centers such as Dambarare and so on. They do not mention Great Zimbabwe at all. But then we are also finding this material which we know is Portuguese. So what could be happening here? Could it be that this material post-date Great Zimbabwe? It's a possibility, but there are also some glass beads that would place this object right within the time of the Portuguese and show that actually the people at Great Zimbabwe accessed glass beads that were also used during the time of the Portuguese. So maybe the Portuguese knew that Great Zimbabwe was there, but chose not to report about it, or more importantly, they were only concerned with the north, where they were obtaining their gold and so on. So it's just anybody's guess can probably work, but that's something that is interesting, particularly in terms of the dating of Great Zimbabwe, because this is certainly indicating that Great Zimbabwe partly overlaps with the Portuguese period. There are other activities that were taking place at Great Zimbabwe. So metalworking, these are ceramic crucibles, as well as molds that were used for melting, remelting, as well as casting gold, copper, as well as brass. Brass was coming from the Indian Ocean, and that was drawn into wire, that was hammered into wire, and so on, to produce some of these objects that were recovered from different places. Great Zimbabwe is also famous for its gold. These are some of the gold objects from Great Zimbabwe. The most interesting thing about this gold is that invariably it has between 7 and 12% silver. The balance being gold. So it's it has enhanced levels of silver. Most mines that are suspected to have supplied this gold, Rengo mine, as well as some in Mberengwa towards the Gwanda West Nicholson gold belt, that's along the Great Dyke. The gold there also has some elevated amounts of silver. So that makes it pretty difficult to tie it to an area. But that just suggests that the technology to separate the silver from the gold was not there. So the gold was just perhaps exported like that, and then the people on the Swahili coast would then have separated the gold from the silver. So that shows that this is indigenous gold worked using indigenous techniques. This is just more of the same, but with also some of these glass beads. And part of the thinking is that some of the gold was also exchanged for glass beads and other ones. So you also get some nice, very composite. This is an iron sword, which also has some copper. So you also find these composite tools from different areas. These barbed bronze spearheads from the hill complex, and some of these copper ingots, the so-called Katanga crosses. So this one is probably very interesting because the region where they are mostly associated with is modern-day Lubumbashi in the Democratic Republic of Congo, what was formerly known as Katanga. Does that suggest that Great Zimbabwe had connections with that region? Yes, there are also some double iron gongs that were recovered. I think it's about 5 sets which were recovered from Great Zimbabwe. Based on the ethnography, the known distribution of those metal gongs is north of the Zambezi River. So nothing much is known south of the Zambezi. Hence, the thinking that those gongs would have come to Great Zimbabwe through contact with Central Africa. Whether it was direct or indirect, that's another thing and difficult to tell. Direct in the sense that you can have people living from Great Zimbabwe going to Central Africa. Indirect in the sense that we can just, it can be a relay. I just pass this on to him. He passes that on to the next person. It ends up at Great Zimbabwe, but without contact between Great Zimbabwe and Central Africa. So we have to think about different combinations and permutations in terms of what could have happened. So, what were those walls at Great Zimbabwe used for? What is their significance? Who lived in them? And what did they do? Well, a number of archaeologists have come up with interpretations. One of them is Professor Tom Huffman, who developed what is known as the cognitive structuralist interpretation of Great Zimbabwe. So cognitive structuralism is a theory that used, once upon a time, it used to be very fashionable in archaeology, and of course it was borrowed from sociology and anthropology and so on. So just looking at cultural structure as well as the associated symbolism. So what Huffman also did was that he marshaled a significant amount of evidence from Portuguese records, oral traditions, and he also consulted Shona and Venda ethnography to come up with a model that could empower him to read meaning out of features on the walls. So, for example, some of the designs on the walls according to what are the symbols say in terms of Shona philosophy or Venda anthropology. Huffman would then associate that with, different genders, social classes, and so on. I will unpack this a little bit further. But the key thing from this slide is that Huffman came up with a 500-year-long ethnographic present beginning with the Portuguese and using their observations in conjunction with the oral traditions and the Shona and Venda ethnography to come up with leads with which to interpret Great Zimbabwe with. So these are some of the designs. According to Huffman, in a given community, the way people think and view their world is the same. So you tend to find that there is what he calls a design structure or a design code, where you find that if a culture or if a society has a way of decorating things, then you would also find that those designs are also found on different categories of material culture. He experimented that with pots, where he looked at the designs on Zulu pots, the designs on Zulu beadwork, and other designs. And then he realized that the designs are basically the same. So that gave him confidence then to say, well, let me look at the Shona material culture. So these are divining dices, which sangomas use. So you shake them in your hand, you throw them onto the ground. If they face this side, it means it will rain tomorrow. If it faces the other side, it means something else. So based on that, he then came up with these symbols and associations. And as we will see, these symbols also appear on the different walls at Great Zimbabwe. So based on those symbols, Huffman came up with what is known as the Zimbabwe pattern. So the Zimbabwe pattern, according to him, it is comprised of a palace for the king. So the palace, according to Huffman, is the hill complex. That is where the king resided. And then there is also a court within the Zimbabwe pattern, and he is getting this from Portuguese records and other bits and pieces of eclectic information. So according to Huffman, this is the judicial court. Yesterday I mentioned that the sizes of courts determines the significance of a place and so on. So it's not surprising that there is a court here. The most interesting thing, though, is that the court, of course, naturally, it's an open space because people just come and sit and then they retreat to wherever they come from. Then at Great Zimbabwe also, this open space, which is also demarcated a court here, there is also nothing. But that is where that golf course was. So which is which? The debate is, is it clean because it was a court or is it clean because it was a golf course? That is controversy that is still going on. Then these valley enclosures here, according to Huffman, and based on the designs on the walls and the symbols that he associates with some of these walls here, he argues that that was the residence for the leaders' wives. Remember, those back then, polygamy was perhaps quite popular. What is interesting then is that from the valley enclosures to somewhere there, it's more than probably 800 meters. And then if you add that steep distance climbing the hill, I don't know what the distance will add up to. But some cheeky critics such as David Beach have said that, well, maybe these wives were very fit because, commuting from this distance and the steep-sided nature of the hill, what they were trying to demonstrate perhaps is the implausibility of that. But nevertheless, if we are to be fair to Huffman, then these valley enclosures are reserved for the royal wives. That is where they were living. And then there's also a residence for the followers. Where were the followers? The followers, according to Huffman, were in this area here. And this perimeter wall divided the royalty from the commoners. So the commoners are in this area, the western part of the site. That's where they were resident, and then the elites were in this walled area. So that is one component, and then of course the whole thing was surrounded by guards to provide security. So the walls, that is the function, a spatial interpretation of Great Zimbabwe, where throughout its duration, the king was always rooted on the hill, the wives were always here. What did I leave out? The Great Enclosure, yes. The Great Enclosure was a center for initiation. So that's according to Huffman, and that is also based on the symbols that appear on the walls. What is interesting about the initiation hypothesis is that the Great Enclosure is the most substantial building at Great Zimbabwe, 2.5 million blocks, and so on. So why build such a gigantic structure for initiation that takes place once a year? Extravagance, isn't it? So these are some of the historical sites. Anangombe, there are these designs that Huffman used to build into this into his model. So just to add to what I said earlier on, and he also interpreted the same designs that are appearing on these walls. He associated the model with, he tested rather the model at Khami. And also something happened here, but it's not really a train smash. But what Huffman also did was that he compared Mapungubwe to Great Zimbabwe. So because this model worked for Great Zimbabwe, worked for the ethnographic present, so last 500 years, and it worked for Great Zimbabwe, according to Huffman, it also worked for Mapungubwe. So the top of Mapungubwe Hill, that's where the king was, and then you have followers. It's basically the same model which is being exported to these sites. So this is just the western enclosure where the king is believed to have been living. The problem is that these places were constantly edited. Details were added over time and so on, and as such there is some controversy associated with that. So if we go to the Great Enclosure, then there are some symbols that Huffman associates with women here, and then he also associates this side with men. Then at the back is also associated with young men and young women. So that's why he then says this is a chamber that was reserved for initiation. And then inside the Great Enclosure, there were an assortment of figurines, some which were stylized and so on. And according to Huffman anthropology, those were similar to the props that are used when initiation is done. So according to him, that then supports the initiation hypothesis. A good friend of mine who works at the University of Pretoria by the name of Charles van Onselen, who is a well-known historian. So we were having a walk down the Charles River in Boston, Massachusetts. And so we started talking about this interpretation. So Charles looks at me and says, Shadrach. And I said, Charles. And he said, archaeologist, what do you smoke? So in other words, Charles was saying some of the interpretations that you come up with, how do you come to think about them? So these are some of the designs appearing on the walls, and they are associated. So you can see these combinations where you have young and then junior men. This is also what is coming from the theory of structuralism. So again, you can find these designs and so on. And it goes on and on. There is also a feature that is known as a speaker's platform somewhere here. So this open space, that's where the people would be sitting and so on. We can skip this. We can also skip this to talk about the weaknesses. So the main interpretation then is that Great Zimbabwe was occupied by the kings and commoners, but the different spaces can be allocated to different people. The king on the hill, royal wives in the valley, initiation in the great enclosure, and so on and so on. But this model has been heavily criticized because it ignores the chronology of Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe developed over time. Remember, we said that period 4 starts somewhere after 1250 and then continues to round about 1600. And based on the architectural typology that was performed by Anton Whitty, we know that the very first stone walls were built on the hill. Those were followed by the ones built in the valley, great enclosure, and then other places come into being. So the challenge then is that where were the royal wives when only the hill complex or only the hill had stone walls? We don't get answers from Huffman's model. And then the other thing is that there is an inherent assumption in Huffman's model that Great Zimbabwe was built according to a cosmological master plan. That is, the people that built Great Zimbabwe, they had a mind map, a template, which they simply went and implemented on the ground. But of course, the idea is that we can see that the site was added to, features were removed, features were added. And that process of editing would have dictated that meaning would not have remained constant. And then, of course, what annoys some archaeologists, for example, David Beach, is that what must be presented to us as hypotheses are given as facts. So when you read Huffman, this is where the king was, this is where the initiation was taking place. But the key question then is, how do you know? But nevertheless, I think Huffman gave us something very exciting to deal with. There are some alternatives that were presented. So David Beach, Paul Sinclair, and Godfrey Mahachi, they talk of what they call the political process model, whereby the different elements of Great Zimbabwe, such as the hill, the great enclosure, and the valley, were at one point or another residences of the kings. And then if you add a chronology onto that, that makes sense. And also the distribution of material culture, the distribution of objects at the hill, in the valley enclosures, and in the great enclosure is more or less the same. You will find mundane pottery, you will find glass beads, you will find Chinese ceramics, you will also find remains of metalworking, and so on, which would suggest that these places were perhaps fully functional and self-sufficient homesteads. So one of the other points that were raised by critics of Huffman's model is that if the valley enclosures were reserved for the royal wives, then who was making a metal that was recovered in the valley enclosures? This is important because in the anthropology of Southern Africa, metalworking is only associated with men. So women are not known to be metalworkers. So if we say that that was the residence for the royal wives, it also means that the same royal wives were perhaps making metal. There's nothing wrong with that, except that that would contradict what Huffman say in some of his writing. Or what is wrong with just accepting that both men and women were living in the valley enclosures? Then, in response to critics, Huffman updated his model. He now says that amongst the Shona people, there is this cultural practice whereby if a couple marry, the very first pregnancy, the first birth is done the woman will go back to her parents. That's where the birth will take place. So it's a well-established institution. So according to Huffman then, in his 2015 paper, he argues that the valley enclosures were a maternity sanctuary for, the Mutapa kingdom, which was based in northern Zimbabwe, some 500 kilometers away. So the Mutapa's wives were brought to the valley enclosures, and so he says, well, this is why I'm saying that my interpretation is valid. And there's also a Portuguese record that says that Great Zimbabwe was occupied by the Mutapa's wives. So how then he knew that, or how he knows that they were pregnant or not pregnant, it's anybody else's guess. It just shows, that this issue is nowhere near any resolution. So let me end here by saying that all the interpretations, particularly by David Beach and others, they do make some sense, given that use and function are correlated. This room is a lecture room, and the setup, the screen, as well as the desks, it's a setup for teaching. It's a setup for lecturing. So if somebody were to come in here, you can, and you are told that, this is a lecture room, you can easily agree because that use and that function, they intersect. So for what David Beach and others are saying, the use and the function, it does intersect. But one cannot say the same about Huffman's model, which I must say it has some admirable levels of creativity. I think I was going to, or I'm still going to talk about the population of Great Zimbabwe, which will take about 5 to 10 minutes. So with your permission, we can take questions. Tomorrow we start with the population of Great Zimbabwe, and then we consider Khami. Do we have any questions? Oh, we are very happy. Yes, sir. Yes, there are quite a number of quarries, particularly at the back of the Great Enclosure. There are some, you can clearly see that as people were quarrying the granite. So the quarries, it's about three or four places that have been identified. And also, while we are still on the subject of quarrying, soapstone. Those beds were made of soapstone. There are also soapstone quarries that are nearby. Yes, ma'am.
Very simple question. The stone that used in the building of the walls, it was trimmed stone.
Yes, so it's blocks of slabs of yeah.
Have any implements been found that was used in the trimming?
No. It's probably, we can make assumptions that it could be hammer stones, it will be metal hammers and so on. But one thing that you cannot miss is that they are nicely and neatly shaped. They are nicely, and so if you place them one on top of the other, they sit, so particularly for the Great Enclosure, you can actually count the courses and so on. You may not find the English bond or some of these other, but at least it's quite, it's a very good standard of workmanship.
Yeah, the three walls at Zimbabwe, how wide is it? As we were looking at the aerial photographs, it looked as if it was quite wide. Is it 2 walls of trimmed stone filled with rubble?
Yes.
And is the tower the
outer face, core inside, 2 meters wide. 2 meters, yeah, 2 meters, 2 point something meters. The tower, yes, it's also the outer face and the core inside. We opened it early last year because it was developing a bulge. So we opened it, and then we managed to restore the wall. And when we dug underneath, we also found some gold bead and some foil. But there is nothing like what those spirit mediums were saying, that if you go underneath there or inside the tower, it's full of gold. No, there's nothing like that. It's just core. Sir, and then we come back to you, ma'am. Sorry about that.
The Portuguese typically only colonized the coast. Did the Portuguese actually get to Great Zimbabwe, or is there records based on hearsay from other people who were then other people who went to Great Zimbabwe?
The Portuguese went as far as about 40 kilometers from Harare, Salisbury. So there is, if you know this place called Jambo Mine, that's about in the Mazoe area. There was a Portuguese trading settlement that is known as Dambarare, and that features that was operational from 1600 to round about 1689. So and then they also went as far as Kadoma, which is what was Kadoma's colonial name? Katuma. Towards Gweru, Bulawayo, which is far deep into the interior. As for Great Zimbabwe, there are no direct reports. The other problem is that Zimbabwe, remember we said it means houses built of stone. It also means a chief's house. So when the Portuguese talk of Zimbabwe, which Zimbabwe are they talking about? Is this Great Zimbabwe? Is it? And let's not forget that even in northern Zimbabwe, there are also those stone-walled sites. So what are they really talking about? That complicates issues. But there is one of those volumes, it's probably volume 6, if not 7, if I'm not mistaken, by W.G. Thiel. He sort of mentions that the Portuguese came probably within, or one of the Portuguese, I think it's either De Barros or Antonio Bocaro, who talks of somebody who came within 60 kilometers of Great Zimbabwe, but they never went there. So that is the biggest challenge. That everything seems to be based on hearsay, and nobody really knows what happened with the Portuguese. Yes, ma'am.
One question and a comment. The question is, where did they get the water?
Sorry?
Where did they get the water?
Okay. Where did they get the water from? So there is Great Zimbabwe in terms of what determined the location. Why did people build Great Zimbabwe there? Actually, access to water is one of those reasons. So there used to be a spring about 300 meters west of the Great Enclosure. Richard Hall and Theodore Bent, they talk of that spring, which is known as Chisikana or a little girl, but that was closed. They poured cement in the 1950s or thereabout, because the local people were coming there to practice ceremonies, and also the freedom fighters were using it as a source of inspiration. So, and also there are rivers around that. So the source of water would have been abundant. But we also need to think about the population when we talk about water and its consumption. So that those water sources that I'm talking about, how many people could they sustain? If we say that 20,000 people, did they work? You have been to Great Zimbabwe. There are those pits that are in front as you go up the hill. So to the right, there are those pits. Somebody is saying that they were water tanks. So that's where water reservoirs. But the problem with that interpretation then is that there is simply no infrastructure, either by way of canals. How do you divert the water? How do you use that water? And more importantly, in summer rainfall areas, if you keep water like that next to your residence, you know what happens with mosquitoes. So there are also so many other things that may make it difficult for us to to believe that some of those features, those pits, were water tanks. But certainly there are one or two springs around Great Zimbabwe, and I hope I won't forget. But I can still add one map which shows the location of those springs for tomorrow's lecture. Carry the water up. There was no other way.
And a comment, Cape Town, we had a lot of people building stone walls or retaining walls, St. James, Gold Bank, and I think a lot of those people who are doing that work are from Zimbabwe.
Yes, you are correct. Let's not forget that Cecil John Rhodes Cottage is also in that area, and that's somebody who used to who has got or who had quite an intimate association with that territory. Yes, ma'am.
Where were the beads manufactured?
The beads were manufactured. It depends on the time period. Some were manufactured in Egypt. So Fustat, near Cairo. Others were coming from modern-day Iran. Some from India. Others from Indonesia. So it varies with time. So how do we know that these glass beads were manufactured in Egypt? These ones were coming from Iran. Those ones were coming from the recipes which were used to manufacture them. So some have the ones from Egypt because they were using that mineral natron. They do have a high sodium. So others also have a high alumina. So by looking at the variation in those elements, we can actually identify the glass beads to sources, and also helped by the fact that the Egyptians could write. So they also wrote their recipes. Then you can just compare from whatever analytical results you have from the laboratory. Yes, ma'am. All of those possibilities, they do work. So they were used, as items for ornamentation. They were also used, in trade and exchange purposes. There's also, so if you go into deep Shona, sometimes lobola is also referred to as chuma. Chuma, that's glass beads. So was there a time when lobola was paid in glass beads? I don't know. but certainly there are some groups that, and if you go to those standard Shona dictionaries like that one done by Father Hanan, you will see that name chuma. That's you would pay that when you are paying bride price. So I think it would have been used for anything as necessary, and wherever demand and supply intersected. Oh. Dear, where are we? So in terms of the manufacture of glass beads, some were made as cylinders, right? With a hole inside and so on. So those cylinders, you can just chop them, right? Those are known as cylinders. But then there are some where it appears as if they rolled the glass, they wound it around something. So that's where the wound beads is coming from. But of course, they did it in a very technically sophisticated way. So it's more about the technique of manufacture. So that's wound beads, cylinders, and so on. Those are the names that archaeologists come up with. Okay, thank you so much. Have a good one.